Hello, friends. Welcome back to TMYS Academy. Today I am with John Cook. John is the professor in the School of Literature, Drama and Creative Writing. He is the Director of Creative and Performing Arts in the School of Literature, Drama and Creative Writing in the University of East Anglia. And it is my great pleasure and honor to be conversing with him today on a topic which is something very, very close to our heart. It is about observation and listening as creative writing tools. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Totally our pleasure. So, Professor Cook, as we had been talking about offline, this is something, there are certain things that we really need to know about creative writing and the various ways to approach creative writing as a whole. So my first question to you is, it is probably simple science that the quality of any output, be it an emotional or a creative or a technical, is correlated to the inputs received in some way. But given this perspective, where a human being is a product of his situations, how does it reflect in his writing?
Well, there are a number of different questions, I think, in the question that you've asked me. And the first thing I'd like to do is just to shift the vocabulary a little bit, if that's okay. And instead of inputs and outputs, let me think about two related words. One is habits, and the second is practices. And what I'm thinking about in thinking about habits and practices has to do with the way in which people prepare or to become writers, or actually become writers by habit and by practice. The one thing I think that is important about writing is not necessarily the observations or sensations or thoughts that you're having, but the actual activity itself of writing, of becoming accustomed on a daily or a regular basis to sitting and writing something. And the reason that I say this is because, in my view, writing is a form of discovery. That's to say, it's not a matter of having a certain amount of whatever it might be, emotion or feeling or a thought or a story, although all those might be important. It's also about what you discover about your material by writing about it. And I've noticed this in my own work, and I've noticed it in the work of others, that while you write, you discover what it is that you're writing about. Okay? So I think one thing you need to do, or one thing that people who want to write need to do, is to practice writing on a regular basis. And that can be done, obviously, by the use of a notebook. Nearly every writer I know of any success or distinction keeps a notebook. And the other thing I think that needs to be borne in mind here is that writing is also a matter of trial and error, the kind of writing that I'm thinking about. That's to say, you might, in your notebook, note down all sorts of things. You might note down something that you overheard. You might note down an idea that you have for a possible story that you might write. You might note down some sight that you've seen, or even the lineaments of some object. But you'll probably have any number of false starts as you begin to think about what it is that you actually do want to write about. So what I'm suggesting in suggesting this is that writing is analogous to, let's say, making a clay pot. It's an activity of making and of shaping, and you need to gather the material together that you're going to shape and make. And in gathering that material together, you're also going to need to discard quite a lot of material that proves not to be useful to whatever it is that you find in the end is the thing that you really do want to make. So I'm not thinking then about writing as expression, and I'm not thinking simply about writing as recollection, although expression and recollection can go into the making of a work. I want to encourage people to think about writing as an activity of making, and habits and practices that go into that. The other thing I'd want to say is, yes, in response to another aspect of your question, this is highly context dependent. What I mean by that is that I talk about writing in a notebook. Well, it may be that you don't have access to a notebook. It may be that you don't have the time or space to sit at a desk and write. It may be that you live in a world where people don't, for example, as they used to in this country, and in some senses still do through email, where they wrote letters to each other. There was the literature of Britain, at least if I can refer to that, in the last 300 years, emerged out of a context of writing by people who weren't necessarily authors, right? Letter writing became a habit amongst middle-class people and upper middle-class people in the 18th century. Okay, so there was lots and lots of people were writing letters to each other. Out of this activity of letter writing actually emerged a genre of the novel called the epistolary novel, in which writers in the 18th century said, oh, look, people are communicating like this. They're writing letters to each other. Let's start making a fictional form out of people exchanging letters. Let's make a story out of people exchanging letters. Now, it may be that you don't inhabit an environment of that kind at all, and it may be that you inhabit an environment whereby the main mode of communication is not through writing, but is through talking, people talking to each other. Okay, so how do you, as it were, shape your practice as a storyteller rather than a writer out of an environment of that kind? I mean, again, I'm talking here about its context dependency. Well, I think what you do is this. You identify the people who you talk to who are themselves good storytellers, and who isn't a good storyteller is often, you know, there's not a certain rule that will tell you who will be a good storyteller and who won't be. But if you find you're talking to somebody who is a good storyteller, then my advice would be simply to do this. Well, reflect a little bit upon what it is that they're doing when they tell a story well. Just think a little bit about that. How does a good storyteller orally tell a good story? How do they set it up? How do they develop it? How do they engage your interest? So even if you're not living in a context where you habitually write or other people habitually write, you can still cultivate the skill, because the art of oral storytelling is in its own way as intricate and as challenging as the art of writing a fiction or writing a poem.
Absolutely. So something that we notice in general is some of the best writers across the world are often extremely conscious about the situations they are into or their surroundings. And they trap both obvious and hidden information from there to be processed through written words. Perhaps they observe more, they listen more, or they're more active in those areas to be able to trap more. So do you agree to this? And if yes, what do you think is the science or art that enables them to do that?
Well, I think if we're talking about writers who are very good writers, I think they often have at least two relations to the milieu, the culture that they inhabit. Okay. One of them is a negative one. That's to say, they are engaged with all the expressions in that culture, all the different manifestations of whatever it might be, of writing novels, stories, or poems. And they come to a very strong conviction that something is missing. It may be that what is missing is precisely the sense of their own cultural milieu. It may be that what is missing is a certain truth that they feel very passionately about. The British writer George Orwell wrote a very interesting essay called Why I Write, and he set out a number of reasons why he wrote, which included the reasons of ambition, of wanting to be heard, and so on and so forth. But he also said that one of the reasons that compelled him to write in the way that he did was the ideological struggle the political struggle that he found himself in the 1930s, and that he had become preoccupied by the power of lying to manipulate people's opinions, and he felt an obligation to expose this, or in some sense to reveal why it was that lies worked upon people so powerfully and led to such disastrous results. So there's that sense of something that is missing, I think, which is quite important in really good writers. I think the second thing that seems to me to be important in very good writers is that they develop a relationship to the language, whatever the language is that they're writing in. Mm. And what they do is they listen to that language. They listen to its sounds, to its characteristic idioms, to its forms and its shapes. And I don't know of any good writer who is not in some way or another a lover of language itself, that they enjoy being with it. They don't think of it simply as an instrument that will communicate their ideas. And this goes back to a point that I was making earlier. They think about it as a material that they live in, that shapes them, that says things that they don't necessarily intend to say. In short, they have an acute sense of language as having a life of its own, and that what they're going to do is in some sense participate in that life and perhaps to enhance it. So those would be two things. The first one involves, I think, amongst some writers, the idea that there is something not being said that needs to be said. The first one involves what I think of as clearing a space. You sometimes need to clear a space for your own voice. You need to push against things that are, the prevailing norms and idioms of how things get said or done.
Right. So how can one develop observation skills and listening skills to aid his imagination and creative writing?
Okay.
I mean, as a professor, since you are into creative writing as well as drama, that's why I felt that this could be something that I can ask you
Sure.
for very specifically. That are there prompts and exercises that can, help a person to grow those in them?
Yes, I think there are. I mean, I think one of the simplest and the most effective that I know is to simply take an object, put it in front of you, and describe it. You can describe it initially as objectively as you can. That's to say, describe its appearance. What is its color? What is its shape? Try and avoid assimilating it to its function for the time being, but just think about it as an object which exists in the world independently of its function, and start describing it. You can, in fact, if you want to, describe a single object at great length, because the more you look at the object, and here I'm thinking about an analogy with drawing and writing, the more you look at an object in this way, the more you find that there is to describe in it. You can focus ever more minutely on the object and find something about it that you didn't see when you first started your description. And I think description is a very valuable and an often underrated art in writing. And so developing your descriptive powers is an important capacity in a writer. And writing about objects objectively is a very good way of doing that. You can then write about it subjectively in terms of your associations with it, what emotions it evokes in you, what memories perhaps it evokes in you, because some objects for some people are highly charged with memory. And it may be, for example, that the object you choose is a photograph. And I think photographs are often very interesting and suggestive in that way, to describe a photograph objectively and then to describe it subjectively. So I think those kinds of exercises are very helpful in cultivating powers of observation and in mapping the distinction between objective and subjective and the transition between the objective and the subjective. In terms of listening, I think there's a very good exercise which involves imagining a room, any room, and then along the lines that I was suggesting a moment ago, beginning to describe it, but at a certain point, putting sound into that room. Imagining what kinds of sounds populate the room. Is it the sound of, say, birds singing outside? Is it the sound of traffic going past? Is it the sound of human voices inside the room? If it's the sound of human voices inside the room, what are those voices saying to each other? What are they talking about? And by doing this exercise, you can find yourself starting a story without any difficulty at all. Because once you've got those people in that room, and once you've imagined what it is that they're talking about, you've got the beginning of an encounter, whether it's a happy encounter or an unhappy encounter, it doesn't really matter. And once you've got an encounter, you've got the starting point of a story. The other thing to do, of course, just to go back again to what I was saying earlier, is in your notebook, if you're using a notebook, is simply to note down what it is that you overhear people saying. There's a huge amount to be learnt from listening to what people are talking about.
So, coming to the next question, observation skills, which is a person's capacity to pick up visual clues from the surroundings, and listening skills, which makes one alert about things he hears and also those that he doesn't hear. Now, this can happen, or this can impact a person both in a positive way and in a negative way, right? I mean, in the last question, we were talking about being alert to these things, being more conscious to receive and reciprocate. Now, what I'm asking is that when I get more conscious about these things, I hear a lot of things, which obviously whatever I am taking inside is affecting my personality. Is there a need, or do you think that is there a need that in that process of cultivating ourselves and our brains, we need to be careful about what is entering us and, if required, to some extent, detach ourselves so that we are clinical about what we are receiving, but not necessarily harming ourselves?
I think that's a very difficult question. And my answer to it is this, that obviously when you, in an ordinary way, experience the world on a daily basis, and you as we were talking about earlier, you're hearing things, you're seeing things, you're smelling things, you're noticing things, whatever it might be, I mean, and some of those are things that give you pleasure, and some of those things are things that give you pain, and some of those things are somewhere in between. Some of the things might shock you, right? They might really upset you. You might, for example, overhear somebody saying something, or they might say something to you which hurts, which wounds you. Words wound. They're not at all neutral objects in that respect. What distinguishes somebody who writes is that what they will do is treat this, in the way that I was talking about before, as material. And that induces an interesting kind of detachment. If you say about this material that what I am going to do is use it as a resource for writing, you've immediately actually begun to introduce a kind of detachment from it by making that choice or that decision. Because it seems to me, once you've decided that that's what you're going to do, you're already engaged in that act of making something out of this material, which I described earlier. So I think writing itself involves quite often, the practice of writing involves a certain sort of detachment.
Right. So how much of creative writing as a talent is inbuilt and comes naturally with inheritance or culture, and how much of it can be developed with practice? Now, I ask you this because it can't be negated that some communities or cultural practices have immense exposure, very sensitively embedded in their growing up processes, compared to others who must start work from a more cleaner slate. And you, as a professor of creative writing, interact with a level of students whose minds are already plowed in a specific way. So, with such levels, how do you plan your intervention?
Well, I mean, I think clearly people are shaped by their, well, they're shaped in part by their biological inheritance. They're shaped certainly by their cultural inheritance. Now, that doesn't mean that this precludes, I think, anything in particular. I mean, I don't think it necessarily stops people from certain things. It can do, but the question is whether it has to. So I'm not saying it can't do that. I'm saying, does it have to do that? And I don't see there being a distinction there between what I call practice and what we're talking about as inheritance, because it seems to me that everybody, anybody, through the practice of an art, whether it be, you know, the art of writing or the art of oral storytelling, however minimally, begins to transform the culture or in a sense, even the biology that they inherit, and begins to make it, in some sense or another, their own, or rather, they begin to put it in. They begin to turn it in a certain direction. So, I think there are enormous differences that people can come into a classroom with. I think that those differences, the first thing about those differences is that they always have to be respected. I think the worst thing that can happen about those differences is that they then become turned into a hierarchy of some kind, whereby one person's experience is deemed to be superior to another's. Everything is grist to the mill when you're a writer. Any experience can be part of your material. It isn't the case that, you know, that successful writers always come from privileged backgrounds, because they certainly don't. If you think of the life story of one of the most successful authors in British history, Charles Dickens, he, for a number of years when he was a child, worked in what was called a blacking factory, where he made shoe polish. He was working in what we might think of now as near slave conditions. But that didn't stop him. He didn't let that hold him back. He had people who were helping him, and I think it's important to have helpers, but he didn't have a privileged background, come to his writing from a background of cultural privilege. So, I mean, in a sense, that seems to me one of the heartening things about writing is that your background doesn't dictate what it is that you're going to become.
So, Professor, many of us today are parents to children, and I would like to ask you this, and know from how the little brains can be effectively exposed to creative drama while reading out to them or through various activities. And I ask this simply because today, when I read out a book to my child, for example, say I'm talking about a tiger roaring, right? Or a cat meowing. I do see that there's a very different perception of both. Tiger roaring is not something that he has seen, but a cat he has. So his understanding of the two and his response towards the two is very different. So given that, today we are in a world where children's exposure to nature has reduced considerably. So, you know, a bird's music or a peacock dancing before the rains isn't something that they're growing up listening or watching. They might hear the technological recreation of the same, but which I'm definitely not trashing. Technology is superb. Having said that, hearing or seeing the original has its organic effect on imagination and application. So that is something that we are a little worried about, the parents especially, that nature plays an important role in perceiving beauty, which impacts the positivity, which impacts positively the brain of a writer. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, again, it's a very big and important question, and I'm not, well, I think one part of my answer to it is this: if we're thinking about how to encourage creativity in children, how to encourage drama or writing or anything of that sort. I mean, I don't think whatever the environment that a child is in, they are always inclined to play. They will, in playing, they will be making things up. They will be inventing a world in some sense, it seems to me. Now, one of the problems that parents live with is that quite a lot of this playing is now happening online rather than in the non-digital world. But it's still a form of play. And one of the things that I think parents might do in relationship to their children's digital world experience is to encourage them to translate it into non-digital forms. I mean, that might be, in however, I don't mean, that sounds rather grand, but it just simply means partly a matter of thinking about asking them about what it is, what digital world it is that they are inhabiting, and getting them to describe that in their own words. You've already started something once you've started that. And I think the other thing is not to criticize the imaginative worlds that they inhabit, but let them build on them, let them elaborate them in their own terms. And one of the things that I mean, I was just watching how children engage with this, is that I do notice that the children that I see and meet and talk to still do a lot of the things that children have done for millennia. That's to say, they'll still find things in the world around them that they'll start to fabricate something with. It might be a bit of cardboard, it might be a box, it might be something that they've picked up, but they'll start to invest it with their own imaginations. They'll start to make it into something that it wasn't before they picked it up. And as to the larger question about the relationship to the natural environment, well, there is certainly evidence that children's contact with nature, the natural world, is diminishing, and this is certainly reflected in Britain, at least, in the range of their vocabulary, which is diminishing in relationship to the names of birds or trees or flowers or whatever. I guess the simplest answer to that is to sort of say, well, try and take them out into the world of nature, but that's easier said than done, because there may be no world of nature to take them out into. There may be only a noisy, traffic-choked street. So their online resources become valuable in another sense, because of course they can at least hear the tiger roar on YouTube if they can't ever see a tiger. I mean, I don't know how many people have actually heard a tiger roar. I have in a zoo, but that's a very specialized environment again. So I think that would be my answer to your question.
Right. My last question to you, Professor. Is there a correlation between creative writing and personal happiness? And if yes, how do you define that?
Well, I think there can be an immense satisfaction in the kind of work that I've been describing, and I think that satisfaction and pleasure arises from the feeling that a number of feelings. One is that you're in a dialogue with the material, with what it is that you're writing, that it's talking to you as well as you are talking to it. I think there is certainly a satisfaction in completing a work that can bring a kind of personal happiness. But I don't think I'd recommend writing simply because it makes you happy, because it can also drive you to distraction as well. I mean, that's to say, it can confront you with problems that you're quite sure how you're going to solve, that you have to work with. So does it make you wiser and therefore bring you happiness through wisdom? It can do. But I don't think it necessarily does do that.
Right. So, Professor, before ending, I will do a very simple job, which is about, I will just read out everything that we have spoken about till now. Yeah. A few takeaways from today's session is, number one, of course, writing improves only when you write a lot. So please do write a lot. Keep practicing. Number two, often writing is context dependent. Who is writing? On that depends a lot of things. So follow or think how, when you find someone who is telling a story extremely beautifully, try to follow that person, try to think how he is saying or what are the methods that he is using, and try to figure if those methods can be your methods or which part of the methods can be applicable for you in order to cultivate that skill in your interest. Number three, understand or identify the most dedicated goal behind your reason to write. What is that ideological reason? What is that specific reason which makes you take up the pen in hand? All good writers are lovers of language. They challenge themselves with how creatively they can express. That is something is very important in creative writing. If you are not a lover of language, it's unlikely that you will ever end up writing something. The next is, take an object. If you have to cultivate that observation, the skill of observation in creative writing, here's a prompt that Professor has given. Take an object, put down on paper its look, features, functionality. Find more and more things to describe. What are the emotions? What are the memories that invokes in you? Try to figure out more things to write about it, and you will find out that there is actually more and more to write about it. Sixth, for listening, if you have to develop your listening skills, in an empty room, try to sit quietly and listen whatever is the sound that you hear around. It could be a bird chirping, it could be something floating in from outside, but the air is talking. Try to figure out, try to trap that particular music, that particular language of silence, and put it down. If you're around, whenever you are around, going around somewhere, take a notebook and pen with you so that you can note down interesting things that people are talking. Those are the stories which will actually help you build up, because people say a lot of interesting things which disappear. You will probably not remember, but something that they say will probably stay with you, and you will have a lot of resources to build up your stories on. Writing by itself is a detachment exercise, because when we document something in our brain, we are probably debating the right or wrong, the moral and the ethics of that particular subject that we are talking about. And finally, for children, it's unlikely that we will be able to take them out of the digital world that they are into at this moment. So since we cannot take them out at this moment, or since their exposure to nature is coming down drastically, and that is a part of the language of this generation, of this era, the best thing to do is probably to get them to describe in words the digital experience that they are having. That will help them to imagine, understand, and interpret the experience that they had had. And that is more important. Thank you so much, Professor, for making time for this. I really, really value this.
Yes, good. So, well, good. Let's keep in touch.
Absolutely.
Okay.